We're going to start with going back to the hummingbird today, and I am going to put in my background that I didn't put in last time, and then we will later on do the red-winged blackbird using some ink to create the values of his feathers. Instead of black watercolor, we'll use black ink. And so I had decided that I wanted to try my ultramarine deep and my sap green behind the hummingbird. And so I have not completely decided if I am done putting any watercolor anywhere else or if I may still put some ink on there. But I figure at this point it's got enough going with it that I can go ahead and put the background in, and then I will decide once I have that on whether I want to add any more. So I'm pulling out Ultramarine Deep, and this is a Holbein pigment because Daniel Smith doesn't carry this. And it's I'm not positive, I would have to check it against French Ultramarine Blue because French Ultramarine is slightly more toward the purple side of ultramarine, and then regular ultramarine is not quite as strong that way. So I'm trying to get out a lot of pigment, but it's wanting to attach to my brush. Okay, I may just have to go back in there. So I want this to be medium to dark, and I'm making a shape behind the bird. I decided to go a little more graphic with this one instead of just filling in the background with sort of soft focus or just a plain color. I decided to put a kind of a pattern back there that has some movement to it because it's got diagonals, and diagonals in a scene will always help give it motion and pull your eye because they're dramatic that way. They're less static. All right, so I'm pulling out some sap. And I may not need all of it, but we'll see. And then I am going to wet my paper. So I want more pigment and then not a whole lot of water over here because I am adding water to the paper. All right. And because I have small and large shapes, I am going to use this smaller round brush instead of a flat or something like that. And I'll just do it in sections. So the biggest thing is going to be, because I have a little piece here and then it has an opening and then there's some more in here, is that I want to try to have my color go across the shape. So if I have mostly blue here, then I want to start with a little bit of blue here and then I can vary it in there. So I don't want it to feel like it's blue and then green and then blue or however it ends up. And I'm just taking a little bit of water off of that. And I wouldn't necessarily have to put the water on this normally because it's a small shape, but because I want it to sort of have the same feel across everywhere, then I'm putting the water in there in order for it to have that same feeling. And I'm just going back and forth between the ultramarine deep and the sap, and I will try to make my edges nice and clean. Depends on where I put the water. Got it, a good edge. Okay. And then there's a little dot right here, just because, oh, I need to pull this guy out. Okay. And this is a bigger shape. And I usually will try to, I didn't quite there, I may have gone over my edge. I usually try to stay back from my edges just a little bit because it's usually easier with the water. It's usually easier to see where you're putting your watercolor, and so I'm not trying to necessarily touch right up to my pencil. And then because this is hot pressed paper, I'm going to go back over this a second time, and that will make it receptive to the water a little more and to the pigment, and make it wait and stay wet longer. Alright, so I have a little bit of blue at that corner, so I'm going to start with the blue and just try to be a little random with it. And I could even leave some white openings as I'm doing this. I decide I like that. Whoops. And this is where trying to just take your time along the edge is a good hold your breath type of thing. I kind of like that light right in there, so I think I'm going to leave that. And this is still pretty wet, so you can see the pigment is really moving. So if you want yours, if you're doing this kind of thing and you want it to stay more where you're placing it, then you want a little bit of the shine of the paper to disappear, or you can dry your brush when you go back to your paint before you touch it to the paper. You can take off some of that moisture. Try to clean that up. And actually, I was going to just touch green right next to his head, but I think I want that to be a little bluer right next to his head, because he's got some green. He's a little warmer green, so I want to make this have a different feel to it. So then as I'm coming next to his head, that's where I want to be real careful. And then I have to decide if I want to leave that shape. I like the blue that's right in there, so I'm going to bring some more of that down here if I can. And I'm not cleaning my brush between, going back and forth between the blue and the green. So there I wanted a little more blue to come forward, and I just kind of wiped my brush off on my palette. And that keeps me from going into my water and adding more water to the mix. And so as this is coming down, I will have to clean, I'm going to have to pull up some of the water that's on the bottom here because it's got too much and it won't let me get down to this corner with, or this corner, this little tip here without possibly making a mess. Okay, I'm going to put that a little darker in there. So I'm just dabbing there. So this is green blue right up here at that tip. So I'm going to go into that. And I am not wetting this area, so it will be a little darker on this piece. And I'm going to go clean my brush just a little bit and get some sap. Oops. So the biggest thing for these is to try to have as clean an edge as you can to make it look more graphic. Okay. And then if that feels a little dark, you can always just pull up just a little bit of the pigment. And then this little tip right here is coming back behind his wings. So I'm going to wet it. I actually have some color on my brush right now, which won't hurt anything. Oh, and I went below, okay. My ink line, I need to get to my ink line and not follow my pencil. And since there is no color for me to worry about matching right now, I think I'm going to use that. And then as I come down, the bigger shape that's in here, I will use the bigger brush. usually, depending on the size of a shape on cold press paper, have to re-wet, but it seems like with the hot press that this really works to do it twice. But with cold press, usually when I re-wet, it's because the shape is really big and I have to, because it's taken me a while to get around. Okay. All right, I am going to, let's see, yeah. I was going to switch to that brush, but I think I'll stick with this one because that way I'm not putting too much water in there. So behind the bird, there's not necessarily, you have to use this color because there's a big gap. If it was a smaller gap, then I might have to be careful about what color I'm putting on first. And so this is more of the mid green. Put some blue in there. And then as it's pooling down here, I'm just going to soak up a little bit of that. Right down at the bottom down here, I have another little drip. It almost feels to me like paint or something, that it's like someone took a brush and went like this right behind the bird. Okay, so then I'm going to get my smaller brush to add some water right here. And right now, I'm feeling like his wings are going to need a little bit of color because I think they're going to be too just plain. This section where it goes behind the flower area is a little more fiddly because you have to find all of the openings that would be behind parts of the flower. And you could pick some and not others, or just kind of guess, because I don't know if I'm even seeing all of them, but it sort of helps pull that shape back behind the flower. Little bit is right here in this corner, and then I will stop at that and let you guys go work on yours, but I probably will add a little bit of tone to his beak because I think it's kind of not really there right now, and then some to his wings before I would be completely done with this. So let me get this last little bit on. And I like some of those little lighter patches that are appearing. To leave it there. I found a spot up here that did not get paint or water, and it's hard edged. So once it's dry, then I can come in with my flat brush and just kind of wake up that area so that it'll kind of blur just a little bit. And once this is dry, then I'll be able to tell, do I want to darken any of the colors on the bird, or do I want to put any more ink marks? Because I think it's that back and forth of is he good, is he standing out, or does he need some more? So I'll let you guys go paint, and then I'll come around and see if you need anything.
And what are you going to do to his bill?
His bill, oh, I can do that right quick. So his bill is kind of a gray on top, and then it goes to black on the side. And so I think what I will do is place a little water, see if I can do this, place a little water at the top edge. And I'm going to use my gray that I already have on my palette, which is the Albero's Fresco that we were talking about.
Sorry.
And I'm going to place that next to that water, but not right at the top. So he'll have that highlight in there, and then I'll bring it down, but that won't be dark enough. So to darken it, I would either mix a black, or I have soda light on my palette, and so I don't have to mix it. Also, you could use ink at this point. You could just take your ink and go in there and add some ink to it. So that will now make his beak stand out. Actually, what I'll do right quick, so that just so you guys can see, and then I'll let you go paint, is I'm going to paint or put just a little bit of color. So I'm pulling out my burnt sienna, and I will take a little bit of that and place it thinly back here. You could also use, because we had mixed, was it, I think it was permanent rose with a little bit of new gamboge to make it a little orangier looking. And he does have a little lighter area right here at the front of the wing, so I'm leaving that lighter. And then this wing is a little grayer because of how the light's hitting it. And so well, I guess I'll pull out cobalt and my burnt sienna and make that, helps if you pull out and don't use everything. Let's see. Okay. So I can, let me pull out just, I was going to say I can vary it, but I used all the burnt sienna up. So I'm going to start at the top, and you could do this wet and wet. Start at the top, and there is a light highlight at the top of that wing. Actually, I am going to put a little water on here because I don't want to necessarily paint in every part of this wing. I still want it to sort of feel like it's more ink, less watercolor on this bird. So by putting in the water, then it will take it in some places, it kind of makes it a little lighter too. So, all right. So a little more brown up in this area. And then it's a little grayer as it goes down. And I think the last part of this wing is this back part right in here. Maybe a little bit there, where I'm going to place just a little bit of color and let it have an area where it feels like I'm purposely not going to the end of it. That and a touch there. Okay. So now he feels like his wings are connected to him, and I think I will even put just a touch of that right there. And then I feel like I am going to come back and add a little bit of color kind of to the side of his green feathers, because I don't think they're going to be quite as strong as I want them to be. But I will look at that. I'll let this dry, and then I'll look at it, and maybe I'll show you guys that before I would put this one away for today. But so yeah, I think I'm happier with that, and I definitely like the beak standing out better now. So. The hummingbird needed just a little more. So I've added some up in the feathers up in here, and I will pass this around in a little bit because I actually made the little marks like the feathers on his head. I made those scallopy looking marks. And
With the paint.
yes, with the paint. And then I went under it with my ink pen. After I had made those marks, I let it dry, and then I took my ink pen and I just went under and made a little scoop under each of those darker feathers. So I've darkened up here already. So if I want to put just a little bit of color under his neck. And I was going back and forth the other day about whether I wanted to do anything under here. So I'm using a little bit of cobalt in there just to tone that lower side of his chin, because that will start to make him look a little more rounded, a little more lit. And I put water up above it. Over here on the water droplets, I also used a little bit of that cobalt. So on a few of those, just taking, I'm gonna try this just a little bit, just a touch of that blue in there, because they do have color. I'm making this up right now because mine is different from what my photo is, and in the photo they've got some of the green from the background, some of the pink, and I'm ignoring all that. And I'm just putting a little bit of blue like they're reflecting the sky, and that'll make them look a little more like water rather than just like what is that weird shape that's under there. So just a little bit of blue, and I'm kind of going around and finding most of them. There's probably a few that I've missed, but so then that also repeats the fact that I put a little blue over on his neck. And then I'm going to go onto these greener feathers over here, and I'm using sap, and that's what it was. I'm using sap and Nugamboge. Can't remember what I had said originally. It might have been, I thought phthalo, but
Yeah, I think you did say phthalo.
okay. So by using a little bit of the color that's already there but darkening it, now he's got a little more value on the side, and that'll make him look a little more rounded as well. Plus it kind of beefs them up just a little bit. I usually feel like they need, unless it's in really bright sunlight, they need just a little more, another layer to add that texture to give them a little more interest. And then this is cobalt with just a touch of sap in it, and I know these are different from my initial colors, but it's basically a cooler blue. And so I'm just trying to put that in there, and I'm bringing it down just a little bit so that there's a little bit right in there. And then I think for now, unless I see something, I think he's good. Oh, actually there was one other thing. I still feel like his belly feathers are not quite as vibrant as I want them. So again, I could use my Quin Sienna because that's basically the perfect mix. But since you guys don't have Quin Sienna, I would use probably the Quin Rose, and I think I used Nugamboge last time to give it sort of an orangey yellow. And I want to put just a touch more of that in there to brighten that even a little more in a few places. Okay. All right, so now he's got, oh, I just saw a little bit of that right here. Wow. I just glanced at my photo, and there's just a little bit, because the Rufous hummingbirds do have some rusty colors in a variety of places on them. So I'll put just a little bit up there. Okay, so now he's got more layers, and I did go back with my ink pen and I added a little more hatching in that part of the feather so that it would separate from the wing a little more. And I added just a little more hatching along the side of the feathers over here to shade that just a little more. And so just kind of going around your painting and seeing, okay, do I want to shade in here? And I did a little down on the belly as well. And I'll leave it at that. can start the red-winged blackbird. So the red-winged blackbird is going to be done with ink, and I have inked in the lines of the bird, the lines of the feathers. I put a few lines up around his head, and this photo is so dark that you can't see those, but I just know from other pictures I have of red-winged blackbirds that they have smaller feathers up in here and they're real fluffy, and so I'm going to give the idea of those feathers, but I'm not worried about doing it exactly. So on the handout that I gave you, because I didn't have time to put lots of words or anything in there, basically the first step is to ink the bird and put in those lines. And I did do, I put in his eye with, made his eye black, and then I put just a little bit of hatching on his beak on the underside of it to give that some value, and then a little bit around his feet. And then I didn't worry about hatching anything else. So then the first thing is to put out a piece of towel, because I am going to get out some ink, and I don't want to get it everywhere. Oops. Yeah, I'll use it from there. And I'm going to be using a brush that I don't normally use for my watercolor, and ooh, there we go. At least it's on the edges.
Thanks.
A little bit of green. I think I will go ahead and use my clear water, because then I know I won't have any green in it. And I'm going to pull out some ink, and so if you guys are doing this, I don't know if you can see that, so I've just basically put some ink in there, and it's not very much, but when I grab some water, I'm going to start thinning it. And then it is really good idea to have a little piece of paper, whether it's watercolor paper or just a piece of scrap sketchbook paper. So I want to make sure that my first layer is not going to be very dark. And so I'm using, ooh, spraying ink. All right, so I'm using a thin wash, and I will basically just start going around the bird. So these are going to be my lightest feathers. And you can also leave, so if you decide I want him to look like his head is more lit, you could leave some whites if you would like. You can also go back if you want to borrow my white pen that I just showed you. You can go back and put whites in if you'd like to as well. And so basically I'm just using this ink thinned down, and that's already a little darker than my first pass. And I'm just thinking feathers that are sort of coming out around his face, and so I'm making those marks because as I get darker and darker, I want to make sure that I am putting my brush in that same manner. Now as I get into this part, it's going to be darker, so I can kind of just fill it in. And this brush is smaller, so I'll try to do this a little faster. Okay. And basically I would go in and fill in these lighter parts of the bird everywhere. And then up here you can just start filling in down here, because these are short little feathers. I'm going to just sort of make that mark. And then I will just do his, I'll blow this dry right quick and show you his head, and then I'll let you guys go get started on yours if you want to do this one. And if you want to keep going on your hummingbird, you're welcome to. All right. So then I would take the ink and I would do the whole bird. Oh my gosh, I am flicking. I have ink there.
I don't think I can be trusted with ink.
No, I don't think I can. I have it everywhere. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I would go around, and for this portion, his brightest section, I did that with watercolor. And so this, these feathers back here, I did leave openings where I will be putting in, using some watercolor to put on, there's some edges of lighter blue and some edges that are sort of gold. So it's not that you have to have that in there, but I just kind of wanted to put that in there as well. So just go along and get the ink everywhere. This is kind of waking up a little bit, and just get him completely covered, and then I can come back and do the darker part. So let me dry this, and then I will show you his head, what I do for that. And basically this bird is about using the ink to do a value study, because you are using the black and you're using it light and then progressively getting it darker where it needs to be darker. So let me dry. And you cannot see in this photo, but there is a defined place between his belly feathers and the feathers right in here. So I actually pushed it the opposite direction, I think, because his belly looks like it's a little darker. But I made the belly darker here, and then kind of this mid value, and then as I started this darker section, I left a little bit of that so that there was a separation. And so as you're doing the head, then you can see with your ink if there's some on the edge that's not got as much water in it, but basically you're just going to start coming in and bringing in the next value and leaving some of those lighter feathers peeking through in places. And that will give his feathers texture and make him look like he's got a fluffy head. And it might be that once you get these on there that you don't need to put others. And it's sort of, they radiate out from around his eye. Okay. And if I can get these in just a little darker, make this go faster. So you might do this in 3 or 4 layers, or it could just be 2 if you get your layers the way you want them the first time. Because basically he's just got a really dark head. So I'll get that on there, and then I'm going to bring this just down over this way and dry this right quick and just show you the final layer that I probably would do for his head. Alright, so I can still see the ink line that I did earlier, and so that will show through, or should, it depends on your ink pen, hopefully they will.
What size brush are you using?
This is a 6, so yeah, I would say you don't want it too small, but you don't need a huge one either because you're doing little feather marks. So now, because that is watered down enough that it's not going to go as dark as I want, I'm going to get out some new ink. So if you guys are doing this and you need to come back and get more ink, just either let me know and I'll bring it around, or you can come grab some. And now I'm going to take my time and just really sort of figure out which way I want the feathers. So those first 2 layers are a little less controlled, and this 3rd layer is taking a little more time to kind of make sure you're putting the feathers on the way they would feel on the bird. And around his head, they come back from, they're going from the beak backward. And then as they come down under his eye, they're moving down from that toward his back. And I would just keep filling it in. And you can make smaller shapes, bigger shapes, depending on the area you're in. And give it that kind of feathery feel and leave some of those earlier layers peeking out. And I would be careful, caution you that you don't just do stroke, 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 stroke and have lots of evenly
Same,
spaced. Yeah, you're wanting to sort of scumble this on, same thing we do with watercolor. So, and you're using the darker ink to, one, give him his color because he is very dark, but also to make some of those lighter feathers peek out. All right, so just leave some openings, but leave them kind of randomly if you can. And randomness is very hard. Okay, so the other thing that you can do is you can tone his beak with some of the black. And since I already have the hatch marks on there, those hatch marks are going to show through just a little bit. And I left a better light on his bottom beak than I did on the upper beak, but he has mostly a black beak anyway. I actually got out of the line there just a little bit too. And it would be then just keep going all the way around the bird until you get his values correct. And then once I had all of the ink on there, then I came back in and I painted the yellow and red in. And I did not put the shadow that is on his wing and across his body in there. I thought, oh, I'll just skip that, but you could if you want to. But if you do that, I would do the ink for the shadow that's on here and then use watercolor to shadow over that. And then the blue and the kind of rusty color that's in some of his feathers on the edges back in here, I put that on with watercolor after everything was dry. And I just did a thin wash over a few places. And you can kind of see that in some places on his feathers back there. And that can help him look a little shiny too, because it's almost like he's got an oily feel to his feathers or something, and you get a little bit of color peeking through. And then the last thing would be if you were painting a bird that's really lit by sunlight and maybe you see some highlights that are very white, then maybe for this guy you would come in with a white ink pen and maybe put a few highlights here and there with the ink pen. But for him I didn't see that, so I did not. Any questions for him?
If we were mixing a color instead of using ink, I'm positive we could even use French ultramarine dark or deep, whatever that's called. And then what would we mix with it, do you think?
I would probably use, if you used French ultramarine deep, I'd probably use burnt umber. You could use burnt sienna, but I think burnt umber is going to be better because it's a little darker in color. And then you could also use, if I were going to do it not with ink but in watercolor, I would use phthalo blue and alizarin crimson mix, the permanent alizarin crimson, because that'll get you a nice dark black. And then you can vary that too. So if you're seeing a little cooler feathers, you could have it be a little bluer in places, and you can vary it that way as well. But if anyone wants to use ink, I have, I'll actually go grab my bottle with the little stop, or the dropper, and then you can have some ink, and I have little glass trace things there if you want to try it. So